Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
You are now listening to Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting indigenous peoples across the globe. This August edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central and South America, Africa, Asia and beyond. Starting news from the International Court of Justice. In a landmark advisory opinion issued on July 23rd, the International Court of Justice declared that countries failing to address climate change may be breaking international law. The court, the United Nations' highest judicial body, stated that a failure to take appropriate action is wrongful act that could lead to legal action and reparation for nations suffering from climate impacts. This ruling stems from a campaign led by specific islander, law students, and the government of Vanuatu, who argued that states have a legal obligation to protect the climate. Ralpha Reagan Vanuatu's special envoy, called the decision a landmark milestone, noting it will hold major polluters accountable for indigenous communities and small island nations who are disproportionately affected. The ruling offers a crucial new tool to demand climate justice and reparations from larger nations. News from UN. The world celebrated the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples on August 9, a day dedicated to raising global awareness and protecting the rights of indigenous communities. The date commemorates the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982. This year's theme centered on the impact of artificial intelligence on indigenous peoples, highlighting both its potential and its risks. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, "Indigenous peoples are guardians of ancient knowledge, defenders of cultural heritage, stewards of biodiversity, and essential to our shared future." He emphasized that while artificial intelligence can help preserve languages and amplify indigenous wisdom, it risks perpetuating exclusion and misrepresenting cultures without proper inclusion and ethical governance. The day served as the call to action to ensure technology supports cultural preservation and indigenous peoples' rights. In USA, 60 years after the Voting Rights Act became a law, indigenous communities continue to face significant barriers to the ballot box. While the Voting Rights Act promised to end racial discrimination in voting, the native voters are still fighting to see that promise fulfilled. Voter suppression, systemic barriers, and recent court decisions are undermining their right to vote. The Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa and Spirit Lake tribes' lawsuit against North Dakota is a stark example. The 8th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that only the Department of Justice, not private individuals or tribes, can sue under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Despite decades of precedent, if this ruling stands, it will severely hinder Native nations' ability to defend their political voice and challenge discriminatory practices. For indigenous peoples, the promise of Voting Rights Act remains unfulfilled. In Canada, indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories have finalized a historic $375 million agreement to protect a massive area of land. The grant, titled Our Land for the Future, will place approximately 380,000 square kilometers, about 2% of the Canada, under Indigenous stewardship. This initiative brings together over 20 indigenous governments, along with federal, territorial, and philanthropical partners. This development represents a significant step forward in conservation and reconciliation efforts. The funding, primarily from the federal government with contributions from the private donors, will support indigenous guardians, climate research, and cultural programs. Leaders emphasize that the deal is about more than just numbers. It's about empowering the initiative. it's about empowering. The initiatives focus on strengthening communities, preserving language, and reconnecting people with their ancestral lands. In Australia, a new report submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council reveals that the Australian governments have repeatedly failed to implement recommendations from royal commissions and coronial inquests, contributing to ongoing systemic injuries for First Nations people. A coalition of over 150 organizations supported the report, presenting it ahead of Australia's Universal Periodic Review. It urges the creation of a national action plan and an independent Indigenous-led monitoring body to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Additionally, the report calls for a Makarrata Commission to oversee truth-telling and treaty negotiations. The proposed measures include reparations for stolen generations survivors and the establishment of National Human Rights Act. People view these measures as crucial in addressing the disproportionate impact of laws and policies on First Nations communities. Now, news from Africa. In South Africa, the cultural and linguistic heritage of the Khoi and San people is facing extinction, says Khoi leader Captain Edmund Wayne Storeman, speaking in a global online workshop titled Researching Race, hosted by the University of Alberta and Queen Mary University of London. Storeman criticized the South African government for failing to recognize the Khoi and San as First Nation people. He said their history has been deliberately left out of the country's curriculum and their stories erased from the national narrative. Representing the Gamtuar ethnic community and Bethel's drop, Nelson Mandela Bay, Storeman emphasized that their fight is not just for recognition but for survival. In his talk titled The Inalienable Right and Disconnected Umbilical Cord in South Africa, Storeman explained that for the Khoi and San, the natural environment, land, sea, mountains, air, and stars, formed the core of their identity and spirituality. These elements are depicted in ancient rock art across the region, with sacred animals like the eland and the praying mantis. He reflected on how colonial invaders, Dutch, Portuguese, and British, drove indigenous peoples from their lands and disregarded their deep connection to nature, instead valuing material wealth like gold, ivory, and spices. In Kenya's Mau Forest, the Ogiek people continue to await justice despite pivotal court victories. In 2017, the African Court on Human and People's Rights ruled that the Kenyan government had violated the Ogiek's cultural, religious, and property rights and demanded their ancestral land be returned. In 2022, reparations ruling followed, ordering nearly 160 million Kenyan shillings to be paid in material and moral damages, and called for formal land demarcation, collective ownership, and official recognition of the Ogiek as an indigenous peoples. At the community elders lament, quote, "A ruling written in ink will not protect my family from the rain," unquote. Homes remain destroyed, beehives abundant, and the forest still out of reach. In Western Sahara, Christopher Nolan's decision to shoot scenes for his next epic, The Odyssey in Dakhla, a city within the disputed territory of Western Sahara, has stirred strong criticism from Sahrawi activists and indigenous rights groups. Western Sahara, home to the Sahrawi people and still classified by the United Nations as non-self-governing territory, has endured over 50 years of Moroccan occupation. Organizers of the Western Sahara International Film Festival, FISAHARA, operating in refugee camps, condemned the filming as a form of cultural normalizations that erases the Sahrawi struggle and legitimizes the occupation. Now, news from Asia. In Thailand, on August 6, 2025, Thailand's House of Representatives passed its first law designed to protect the rights of indigenous communities, marking it the fourth country in the Southeast Asia to do so. The bill, which passed with a vote of 421 in favor out of 425, aims to safeguard the traditions and identities of the country's 6 million indigenous peoples. This new law will address long-standing issues such as land disputes, cultural erosion, and the statelessness faced by many in the communities. Bill's 47 provisions legally recognize their identities and affirm their access to fundamental rights as Thai citizens. This historic vote paves the way for better integration and protection for these marginalized groups who have often been criminalized on their ancestral lands due to conflicts with modern conservation laws. 90 days after receiving royal assent, the legislation will come into effect. In Nepal, a recent report by Amnesty International sheds light on a disturbing pattern of forced eviction in Nepal, revealing a significant gap between constitutional protection and the lived reality for marginalized communities. The report, Nowhere to Go: Forced Evictions in Nepal, documents 5 cases between 2020 and 2024 that have disproportionately affected indigenous peoples and Dalit communities, leaving hundreds of families homeless. These evictions, often carried out without genuine consultations or adequate notice, violate both domestic and international law. The report highlights that authorities often disregard ongoing verification process by the Land Issue Resolving Commission, which is responsible for land allocation for landless squatters and unmanaged dwellers. This systemic failure to uphold legal safeguards has resulted in the severe emotional, physical, and psychological trauma, perpetuating historical injustices against Nepal's indigenous communities. In Philippines, indigenous communities in the Philippines, like the Monobo Dalangan, are preserving health knowledge passed down for the generations by using native plants for medicine. A new study documents 796 plant species used by 34 ethno-linguistic groups, highlighting the deep connection between traditional practices, healthcare, and biodiversity. However, this traditional knowledge is at risk due to deforestation and limited government support. Community leaders and researchers are now advocating for stronger environmental protections and official recognition of indigenous medicinal practices. They emphasize that preserving these vital plants and traditions is essential for both public health and cultural heritage. In Indonesia, Indonesia's government is pushing forward with massive tourism projects in Komodo National Park, a move that threatens to displace indigenous communities and destroy critical wildlife habitat. Proposed luxury resorts and commercial piers built directly within protected areas are jeopardizing the fragile home of Komodo dragon and other endangered species, despite international conservation guidelines. According to the indigenous rights activists, their ancestral lands are being targeted for development without meaningful consultation. According to indigenous rights activists, this aggressive expansion risks turning a UNESCO World Heritage Site into a profit-driven theme park, ignoring deep connections that they have with the land and the history of their stewardship. The situation is not just an environmental issue, it is a human rights crisis that sidelines their voices and threatens their very way of life. Now, news from Latin and South America. In Colombia, in a historic victory for indigenous rights and environmental protection, Colombia's constitutional court has ruled in favor of Amazonian tribal leaders against the threat of illegal gold mining. The court's decision, issued this week, acknowledges that mercury contamination poses a high risk of disappearances to indigenous communities in the region. The illegal challenge was initiated in 2019 by 5 ancestral knowledge keepers known as the Kagurs of Yurupari. The court's landmark ruling mandates urgent protective measures for at least 30 indigenous peoples living in the affected Yurupari territory, setting a significant precedent for similar cases worldwide. In Bolivia, indigenous communities in Nor Lipez, Potosi have declared a state of emergency over the expansion of lithium mining in the Uyuni Salt Flat, fearing it will deplete their already scarce water supplies. A new study by the Center for Research and Documentation of Bolivia highlights the severe threat. The report estimates that 4 new processing plants will demand 47.5 million cubic meters of water annually, an amount 15 times greater than the region's total rainfall. Local communities whose livelihoods and survival intrinsically depend on these fragile water sources are deeply concerned about the significant demand. In response to this growing industrial threat, the communities are now mobilizing to defend their right to water. In Ecuador, Ecuador's government has merged the Ministry of Environment, Water and Ecological Transition with the Ministry of Energy and Mines, a move drawing strong condemnation from environmental and indigenous groups. The controversial executive decree places the protection of forests, water sources, and indigenous territories under the same authority, tasked with promoting oil and mining expansion. Critics argue this merger directly contradicts the spirit of last year's historic Yasumi, the Spingo, Tamacocha, and Tipotini referendum, where voters chose to halt oil extraction in the national park. They view the consolidation as a strategy to fast-track extractive projects, subverting the popular mandate and raising concerns about the future of environmental protection in the country. In Peru, the Masco Piro, the world's largest uncontacted indigenous groups, are in grave danger. Living in the remote border region of Peru and Brazil, this nomadic tribe is facing a triple threat: illegal logging, drug trafficking, and escalating climate crisis. Recent reports highlight a critical lack of enforcement of protection laws, allowing illegal activities to flourish in areas crucial to the Masco Piro's survival, despite efforts to establish a buffer zone around the Madre de Dios Indigenous Reserve. A logging concession spanning over 176,000 hectares continues to operate, intensifying conflict and driving the tribe to the verge of collapse. This ongoing encroachment is forcing the Masco Piro to have more frequent and dangerous encounters with outsiders. Their very existence is now at risk. In Argentina, the Coja indigenous community of Cueva del Inca was forcibly evicted in a dawn police operation on July 7. Despite their recognized legal status, this eviction, which violated Argentine law by taking place at night and without notice, saw police use physical force and destroy family homes. The community resides on land under the Quebrada de Humahuaca, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, since 2003. This violent displacement is believed to be motivated by real estate and extractive project interests. In defiance, the affected families have returned to their territory, vowing to continue their fight to reclaim their land. In Costa Rica, in a historic act of self-determination, the Cavecar people of Grano de Oro, Costa Rica, have approved 2 key plans for their community's future. During a recent assembly, members of the 24 communities comprising the Association of Women Caretakers of the Earth voted to adopt both a community conservation plan and a community development plan. The gathering featured respectful dialogue and active participation from representatives, youth, and local residents. The approved plans are testament to the community's commitment to sustainability and ancestral knowledge. The central goal of the conservation plan is to protect Mother Earth, ensuring environmental resources are available for future generations. This milestone marks a significant step in the Cavecar people's effort to safeguard their heritage and natural surroundings. In Brazil, during a historic visit to Xingu National Park, Kaiapó chief Raoni Metuktire used the occasion of receiving Brazil's highest honor, the National Order of Merit, to deliver a sharp rebuke to President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Speaking in his native language, Chief Raoni directly criticized the government's plan to extract oil from Amazon Delta. Quote, "I know you are thinking about the oil beneath the sea in the Amazon Delta. I think you should not extract it." Unquote. Raoni stated, he warned that the deep water extraction could worsen pollutions and global warming, urging the president to prioritize environmental protection. The powerful exchange underscored growing tension between the government's economic ambitions and indigenous people's fight to protect the Amazon rainforests. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next broadcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads, and Blue Sky.